Greetings to our tens of listeners from CBC Studio A, and welcome to another episode of Discernment Digest, where we offer a rundown of news items that present questions of obvious concern for those of us holding to a biblical worldview. And then I usually focus on a biblical teaching on a particular topic that's designed to inform and build up Christians. For that latter portion in today's episode, I'll continue a look at the principles that undergird biblical counseling. That was a listener-requested topic that I started 2 weeks ago. And I'll do that by showing how biblical counseling looks at our struggles through the lens of the biblical worldview, which, surprisingly to some, precedes the Bible itself. And I'll say that again. The biblical worldview precedes the giving of the Bible. And that has ramifications for both how we interpret the Bible and how we use it in biblical counseling. And I'll explain that biblical counseling piece later in the show. But before that, for this week's digest, it's been only 7 days, but each week seems like a month's worth of much of the same, really. A barrage of misinformation regarding the Iran war, continued self-dealing on the part of our president and his family. The Trump-endorsed candidate won the primary for the U.S. Senate in Texas this past Tuesday, as expected. The lawfare weaponization against the president's enemies both contracted and expanded this week. And Donald Jr. got married to a person with an interesting background that prompts me to make a bold prediction in a bit. When I recorded last week's podcast a week ago, the president had gathered his top advisors and had made statements on social media suggesting yet again that the end of the war with Iran was imminent. As I record this week, we are still at war. I said a few weeks ago that the apparent confusion about our strategy over these now 3 months can be variously attributed, but I said, I hope I'm wrong, but the Occam's razor explanation is usually correct, yet I didn't say what that explanation is. I'll say so now. It seems the most obvious explanation is that the president did not think this through before attacking. Perhaps because we were previously able to topple the regime in Venezuela and did so in a quick and easy fashion, and so he was emboldened to expect the same in Iran. Whatever the reason, unless the president is in fact playing the five-dimensional chess that some attribute to his brilliance, it may well be that we're in a quagmire of his own making, unfortunately. But by the time of next week's episode, perhaps there will indeed be a deal. Stay tuned. I mentioned last week a number of stock investments the president had made in companies that he promoted in his capacity as president. One of those was Dell Computer, for which he bought millions of dollars worth of stock. And 9 days later, in a speech in Georgia, he told the crowd, quote, "Go out and buy a Dell Computer." Well, it turns out it is much worse than that, because this past week, Dell was awarded a massive $9.7 billion blanket purchase agreement to consolidate software acquisitions across the U.S. military, intelligence community, and Coast Guard. Now, some of you may be thinking, yeah, but what about the other side? What about the Democrats and their self-dealing? What about the Biden crime family, as President Trump incessantly refers to them? Why don't you talk about them? Well, I remind you that the reason I don't talk much at all about the Democrats is because, literally, I doubt that more than 2 people who listened to this voted for Democrats. I know I did not, and given the party's stance on moral issues like abortion and marriage, I never could. And that's true for just about everyone who listens to Discernment Digest. So I don't do whataboutism, as it's frankly lazy thinking, and it's not applicable to nearly all of us associated with this podcast. Now, this president is the only one in my lifetime who has refused to make his tax returns public. It's a practice that has been followed because that kind of transparency helps avoid conflicts of interest whereby presidents can use their position to enrich themselves. President Trump is often given credit for foregoing his presidential salary and for even bothering to run, since it's assumed he's a billionaire who's clearly not in it for the money. Well, one, we don't really know his financial position since he has not released his returns. But remember that many of them were leaked in 2019, and they showed him owning struggling properties and having hundreds of millions of dollars in debt that was coming due. So whether he needs the money or not, he is making vast sums while president, as is his family. This past week, it was revealed that Donald Trump Jr. took a financial stake in a startup company in North Carolina, and 3 months later, the Pentagon announced plans to lend money to that startup company, and big money, $620 million. And that request to loan hundreds of millions of dollars to that firm linked to Donald Trump Jr. was made by Peter Navarro, who is a White House advisor to President Donald Trump, and he is a friend of Trump Jr.'s. Now, speaking of Don Jr., he got married for the second time 10 days ago to a woman with an interesting family connection. Her father was Jeffrey Epstein's banker. Now, to be fair, both Don's and his new wife's families have homes in Palm Beach, as did Jeffrey Epstein, so it may be that he just happened to be the banker to whom Epstein went, and the banker had no idea what Epstein was up to. At least we can hope that's the case, though the Trump administration releasing all of the Epstein files as promised would be welcome and could hopefully answer some understandable questions about, for example, what the president knew, if anything, and when did he know it. We know that for many years that Trump and Epstein were very good friends. We know that for Epstein's 50th birthday, Trump was one of many who gave happy birthday wishes, and we know that he did that because of his sexually explicit birthday card is one of the items that has been released from the Epstein files. Let us not forget that Jeffrey Epstein was someone who trafficked and abused children. Anyway, Don Jr. is now married to the daughter of Epstein's banker. Now, here's a fun fact. Did you know that between Don Jr.'s two marriages, he had a years-long relationship with a girlfriend named Kimberly Guilfoyle? Guilfoyle was for years a fixture on Fox News Channel's The Five. She is now our country's ambassador to Greece. But that's not the fun fact. Instead, it's that from December of 2001 to February 2006, before she was Don Jr.'s girlfriend, she was married to the current governor of California, Gavin Newsom, when Newsom was mayor of San Francisco. Newsom is said to be running for president in 2028 as a Democrat. Now, I said I would make a prediction, probably foolish for me to do so, but I'm going to plow ahead. And it's related to the Epstein scandal. Now, as background to the prediction, recall that in July of last year, our now acting Attorney General, Todd Blanche, went to the prison where Epstein's longtime girlfriend, Ghislaine Maxwell, was serving a 20-year sentence for trafficking underage girls for Epstein and his powerful friends. And Blanche interviewed her over 2 days. Exactly 1 week later, she was transferred to a better jail where she remains. Now, Todd Blanche was formerly Donald Trump's personal attorney. So the president's former personal attorney, who is now the acting Attorney General of the United States after the firing of Pam Bondi, it was he who made a special trip to Maxwell's prison, and a week later she was transferred. Now, I cannot prove that some kind of deal was struck, but I can say she's gotten unusual and favorable treatment. And of course, she would like to be out of jail, and she's made a formal request to President Trump for a pardon. I predict that Donald Trump will pardon Ghislaine Maxwell. But he will not do so until after November, when the midterm elections are over. If he does not do it at that time, I think it will be before he leaves office in 2.5 years, but I think it will be before that, when the electoral pressure is off, perhaps by the end of this year. The president's endorsements for candidates in the primaries are virtual guarantees that those candidates will win, and that happened again this past Tuesday in Texas when Ken Paxton defeated John Cornyn, who had served in the U.S. Senate for 24 years. Now, already I'm seeing Texas evangelicals rationalizing their support for Paxton. I grant that they cannot vote for the awful Democrat opponent, so fine. In this general election there in Texas in November, we have the lesser of two evils again. But what explains so many Christian people voting for the likes of Paxton in the primary, in which you had a man of far superior character in Cornyn? Paxton has all of the character problems that I mentioned last week, but despite that, he won big in the primary over Cornyn, whom Trump deems to be insufficiently loyal. So score another win for the president in this year's primaries. But it now means Cornyn joins at least a half dozen disaffected Republican senators who can make life difficult for Trump's agenda in the remaining 7 months of the term, as those senators are no longer beholden to the president politically, and they have each shown a willingness to vote against him even when they were, and so that was the reason that they fell out of favor to begin with. The final 2.5 years of Trump's second term, when he too has no personal political electoral pressure as he can't run again, those 2.5 years are going to be interesting times, to say the least. I said at the top of the show that the lawfare weaponization against the president's enemies both contracted and expanded this week. It contracted in two ways. First, a judge has temporarily halted the so-called anti-weaponization fund about which I told you last week, which resulted from a deal that was struck by the IRS and the Department of Justice, both of which are under the president's authority. It's a deal to settle a lawsuit that he had brought himself in his personal capacity as a citizen, and it was a lawsuit against the IRS. And he had sued for $10 billion, but just 2 days before the suit was going to likely be dismissed by a judge, the IRS and the Department of Justice dropped it, and they agreed to set up a $1.776 billion fund. Get it? 1776. It's a patriotic fund, we're to understand. The proceeds of that will go to so-called victims of legal weaponization by the Biden administration. People like the rioters on January 6th, for instance. Now, doing that, dropping the original case and just settling it between the IRS and the Department of Justice, had the effect of bypassing any judge in the process. Well, the judge that would have decided the original case has intervened anyway, because 35 retired federal judges challenged the settlement. They argue that the agreement is the product of collusion and that it constitutes a fraud on the court. Meanwhile, a different judge has halted the $1.776 billion fund because prosecutors that were involved in the January 6 cases have sued, saying that that fund is illegal. So it's quite likely that this slush fund will be, in the end, declared illegal. But the mere fact that such an unprecedented thing has been tried is troubling. The second way the weaponization against the president's enemies has been restricted is because the case the Justice Department has brought against former FBI Director James Comey for allegedly threatening the life of the president by posting a photo of the numbers 8647, you remember? 86 means to remove. President Trump says it means to kill. 47, he's the 47th president. So he's saying that photo of shells on a beach arranged as 8647 was a message to kill the president. Well, that case is in trouble as expected. The prosecutor in that case resigned this past week. I can say with great confidence, even as a non-lawyer, that the case is going nowhere. But as I said a few weeks ago, the cases do not need to be successful in order to intimidate those against whom they are brought. And ironically, even as the administration seeks to set up a fund for supposed victims of Biden's legal weaponization, it's bringing suits like the one against Comey, and it expanded those efforts against the president's enemies this week, opening an investigation against E. Jean Carroll for possible perjury. So who is E. Jean Carroll? She won an $83 million award against Donald Trump a few years back because a jury found him liable for sexual assault against her. That award has been upheld on appeal, and Trump has appealed to now the Supreme Court to overturn it. That's pending. Meanwhile, an investigation has been opened against her by the Department of Justice. Remember, the Department of Justice works for Trump. Well, okay, enough of all of that for this week. I want to turn now to the principles that undergird biblical counseling. I said that's a listener-requested topic and something that I started 2 weeks ago. I'll begin by talking about a temptation that I had in my younger years to become what is sometimes called a Renaissance man. That is, someone with a deep, expansive knowledge and proficiency across a wide variety of subjects. Now, I said I was tempted by that in my youth, so chalk it up to the sinful arrogance of youth. But for years in my 20s, I spent thousands of dollars on books, almost entirely nonfiction, on history and politics and economics and sociology and the like. This was before the internet. So books and also the many magazines to which I subscribed, those were the primary means of acquiring knowledge. But the more I read, the more I realized that the information was repetitive in that, although the writing was from different people who varied their presentation to make it interesting, I found myself sifting what they said through a handful of foundational concepts that I had learned in studying the Bible and theology. Thankfully, many of the books I purchased were on biblical and theological topics in preparation for and during seminary. Now, a quick story in that regard about a supportive and forgiving wife. In my first semester of seminary, an announcement was made in chapel that a man in the area was selling his library. It was a collection that he had amassed in Bible college in anticipation of going to seminary, but he had since decided that seminary was not for him, and he was selling then that library. He had purchased nearly every textbook and reference work I would need in seminary. So I went to his house that afternoon, and instead of buying piecemeal, I asked what he wanted for the whole thing. I bought about 800 volumes for $800. An absolute steal, except that the 800 I paid came from a fund that Kim and I had amassed to get a new roof on our first house. Now, I said she was supportive and forgiving, and indeed she was both, but not immediately. I'm thankful that she came around, and I've lived to tell about it. I learned to be a bit more selective about the books that I purchased. Bible and theology were almost always good investments, but outside of those categories, I found that other works were useful to the extent that they dealt with foundational topics that would serve as lenses through which to see everything else. Works of Christian philosophy and apologetics fit into that category. so that books by men like Francis Schaeffer were formative for me. I still have his 5-volume hardcover bound set of all of Schaeffer's books, including The God Who Is There, He Is There and He Is Not Silent, Escape from Reason, and his magnum opus, How Shall We Then Live? The Rise and Decline of Western Thought and Culture. And I found other thinkers and writers to be helpful, including those not explicitly Christian, but who analyzed subjects carefully, and they dissected what was good and bad and told why. People like Alan Bloom, who wrote The Closing of the American Mind. Robert Bork's books, The Tempting of America and Slouching Toward Gomorrah. Christopher Lash's The Culture of Narcissism, Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death, and Thomas Sowell, A Conflict of Visions. Not only did I start to save money because I was more selective and so more limited in my book purchases, but looking at life through that worldview grid increased my confidence in and my thankfulness for that way of looking at all things, because I became all the more convinced that it was and is the best way because the right way. It has explanatory power for literally everything. So let me give a more current example of how I sift what I hear and read and how it confirms that my choice to limit is, in fact, a good one, and that for the things I do read and listen to, the biblical worldview has already been there and done that. Really, that after the first 3 chapters of Genesis, all else are footnotes. I mentioned the Renaissance man ideal that some have, and to which I was tempted. I listened fairly regularly to a guy named Jonah Goldberg, who co-founded the Dispatch, which I've recommended to you. He co-founded it after leaving the Fox News channel, where he was a regular commentator, but he left after Tucker Carlson's disgraceful and false Patriot Purge faux documentary. And Jonah has a podcast at the Dispatch called The Remnant, on which he often interviews guests, and he does a Saturday version called The Ruminant, on which he usually just riffs on whatever he wants to talk about for an hour or so. You don't have to listen to Jonah for very long to conclude that this is a very, very widely read and smart guy who retains much of what he's read and can repeat it on command. He loves to debate and push back and to be pushed back on, and overall he has a pretty good view of things. But for him, like so many other intellectuals, and I say this with respect and I say it carefully, but I think it's true. In the words of the Apostle Paul in 2 Timothy 3, he is, quote, always learning but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. Now, that's about false teachers in the church. So perhaps more accurately for Jonah, he's like the philosophers that Paul encountered in Athens, of whom Luke says in the book of Acts, chapter 17, verse 21, quote, all the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. For Timothy's false teachers and Paul's philosophers in Athens, and any Renaissance man by whatever name, their knowledge pursuit is to arrive at truth, rather than to apply the knowledge that they gain to the foundational truth we already have in the opening chapters of the Word of God. So as example, on this past weekend's Ruminant, Jonah is recounting a couple of interviews he had earlier in the week with some guys talking about liberalism and post-liberalism and integralism and several other isms championed by a host of people. And he said he got feedback saying that folks liked the interviews, but they felt like they missed the first class, and so they didn't understand all that was being said. And so on the Ruminant, Jonah is explaining. Now, I've slightly modified what he said to make it clear because in some spots, I think my AI-generated transcript is not completely accurate, but you'll get the idea. He says, I'm not trying to talk down or make anyone feel dumb. I'm just explaining, so I'll break it down. Post means after. Post World War II, for example, means after World War II. Liberalism means a political system primarily dedicated to the protection of liberty, specifically individual liberty. That's how John Stuart Mill describes it. That's how John Locke describes it. That's how Thomas Hobbes describes it. But Hobbes, though he's similar to Locke, he's also the guy who said, quote, "The state of nature is red in tooth and claw." Hobbes is basically saying it's all against all and you're on your own, and the only way you can protect individual security and freedom is with a strong sovereign. He calls it the Leviathan, which doesn't quite necessarily mean the king. It more means the commonwealth, the system that secures liberty, but the commonwealth needs to be run by a sovereign who sometimes gets called Leviathan too. But it's just strong, centralized government, someone who decides. Anyway, Jonah goes on, the focus of liberalism is on the sovereignty of the individual and the importance of protecting the liberties of individuals. It kind of starts with Locke, and, it gets expanded by Mill and Hobbes, but some think liberalism just comes out of the Enlightenment, and it's something that the post-liberals and most liberals agree with. Although some of us argue that liberalism doesn't actually begin with a kind of virgin birth in the Enlightenment, 300 to 500 years ago. It's actually built on the pillars, says Jonah, of Judaism and Christianity and the medieval church. And it takes these elements and updates, refines them, and liberalism has more continuity with the pre-modern past than a lot of its biggest fans and biggest critics claim. He goes on, this is why Bonner, on my podcast earlier this week, was talking about singling out Steven Pinker, saying liberalism just sort of has this virgin birth out of the Dark Ages. This is like Immanuel Kant, who wrote his famous essay, What is Enlightenment?, where he says enlightenment is, I'm paraphrasing, says Jonah, the sudden maturity and realization of humankind from its dark and feudal past. And the post-liberals are people like Patrick Deneen, although I've seen signs that he's trying to just sort of say, okay, never mind, and Adrian Vermeule. And what they have in common with people like Pinker is that they think this was sort of a wrong turn, and that just comes out of the Enlightenment and Locke and Rousseau. It's like this quest to find the first liberal thinker who created liberalism in a lab, and I think that's the wrong way to talk about it, he says. What is he talking about? And how could it be simplified? By running through a biblical worldview. That's the Renaissance man kind of approach. How could it be simplified? What's he saying? Well, the last 10 years or so, there have been voices saying that liberalism has given us too much freedom, and it's made a mess of things. This liberalism comes from the Enlightenment, they say, and guys like John Locke, whose thinking had a profound effect on our nation's founding. So we need to reject Locke and move past liberalism and all of this individual freedom to post-liberalism, in which freedoms would be appropriately restricted by government with guidance from the Roman Catholic Church. As the proponents of this move past liberalism are prominent Catholic academics. The aforementioned Patrick Deneen is at Notre Dame, and the aforementioned Adrian Vermeule is at Harvard Law School. And both of them are, as I said, prominent Catholics. It's a sophisticated and Catholic form of Christian nationalism. Now, Jonah mentioned other names like Locke's contemporary, Thomas Hobbes, and the guy that he interviewed this past week named Bronner, and they talk about and criticize Harvard professor and atheist Steven Pinker. But a Christian worldview can boil all of this down pretty easily without all the names and all the isms with something like the following. Government is best when it's limited, and it works to secure the natural rights of its citizens, rights that come from God rather than government. So the government protects freedoms and maintains basic order so that individuals can pursue meaningful lives. And that notion is based on people being made in the image of God and given rights by Him. But those rights need protection because although a biblical worldview starts with creation and the way it's supposed to be, it also takes into account the fall and the way it is. So government is needed to protect our rights because they're always under threat. But since those who govern are themselves fallen, the government needs to be constrained and separated to prevent it from becoming tyrannical. Now, what I just said is quite similar to what you'll read in the Federalist Papers from James Madison, some of which came from the philosophy of John Locke and not directly from the Bible. But the Christian can read Locke or Madison and can filter their ideas through the biblical worldview because their good thoughts are gifts of God's grace, but gifts of His common grace. Now, what does all of that have to do with biblical counseling? Well, in much the same way that the Bible provides our worldview regarding human nature as both imago Dei, that is the Latin term for in the image of God. Human nature is in the image of God, but it's also fallen. We have a sin nature. And we apply those truths to the common grace thoughts of thinkers like Locke and Madison. Well, so too, our biblical view of reality as God-centered and human-focused allows us to evaluate the common grace insights of even non-Christians for whether they are unknowingly borrowing from the biblical worldview and therefore stating truths that we can use in our help of those who are struggling. For example, when research tells us how the body reacts to trauma, we know that Scripture teaches that we are embodied souls, so that our spiritual well-being can be affected by physical factors. And we're going to pay then close attention to what's being discovered about the body's role in processing and dealing with trauma. But we know some more than the secular researcher does, namely that the sufferer was already struggling before whatever traumatic event it was because they were and are fallen. And they've spent years viewing and processing their life in a better or worse way. So a biblical counselor would be concerned not only about the physical issues, but especially the spiritual issues, as we were made for God. We were made to transact with God. We're naturally estranged from God, and that's affected how we process everything we do and how we process everything that happens to us. I said at the beginning that, quote, the biblical worldview precedes the giving of the Bible, and that has ramifications for both how we interpret the Bible and how we use it in biblical counseling. What I mean by that is that we do not need a chapter and verse for all of our conclusions. There are extra biblical truths, but we can never adopt unbiblical positions. Now, as a quick proof of that extra biblical idea and the worldview the Bible gives preceding the canon of the Bible itself, consider this. What we have recorded in the very first chapter of the Bible was not written until at least 2,500 years after the events it describes. The first chapter of Genesis, the second chapter of Genesis, the third chapter of Genesis, and all of those early chapters, they were not written until thousands of years after the events that they describe. That is, even the most conservative estimate of the time of creation in, say, 4000 BC, that precedes Moses writing down what happened in 1500 BC by 2,500 years. Yet we know from what was written in 1500 BC that at least 2,500 years before, God had given the dominion mandate in chapter 1 and verse 28 of Genesis to fill the earth, to subdue it, and to rule over it. So for millennia prior to the first book of the Bible, people were doing that, and they were living via natural law and oral transmission what God had told Adam. In fact, in Genesis chapter 4, the line of none other than Cain is said to be pursuing helpful inventions for human flourishing, in keeping with the dominion mandate for humanity. Genesis 4 and verse 20 says this, Jabal was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all who play stringed instruments and pipes. Their nephew, Tubal-Cain, forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. And God's people made use of these inventions and products later for God's good ends. So biblical counseling means following all that the Bible says about all that we can use for human flourishing, starting always with God's revelation to us now that we have it in completed form, and then using that revelation and common grace insights to offer help to the whole person, soul, and body. Well, if you have any questions or comments, you can send those to discern@cbctrenton.com. I hope you can listen again next Monday. In the meantime, have a great week serving and discerning.